Dynamic equilibrium is present in mature ecosystems. It's characterized by long-term balance. Populations remain relatively stable over time. Because there is great biodiversity, all of the organisms in the area are already there. Few may die and a few may be born. There could be some immigration and emigration, but over time, there is stability. It can be compared with homeostasis. There are two population types. Open populations are where immigration and emigration occur. In closed populations, density changes are a result of natality and mortality only. There's no immigration or emigration. An example of this would be a game preserve. Growth curve is a graph showing fluctuations in a population over time. These changes can be examined and then analyzed. The x-axis is time. It's the independent or manipulated variable. The y-axis is the density or number of organisms, the dependent or responding variable. The closed population growth curve can also be called an exponential growth curve or J-shaped growth curve. It can look like this. Here is the J portion. It's exponential or fast growth. It could also look like this or like this. So as long as it has that exponential growth part and it doesn't level off, it is called a J-shaped growth curve. In most growth curves, we have four phases. First of all is the lag phase, where it is slow growth because there are not enough reproducing organisms. Second is the growth phase, and in this case, it is exponential growth. Third, right at the top, it is stationary, so it levels off just for a moment there, where natality, or the number of births, equals mortality, or the number of deaths. Then last, the death phase or decline is not always present, as in this example here. Comparing J-shaped curve to an S-shaped curve, the J-shaped curve increases exponentially, and it may just keep going up, or it may suddenly decline. The S-shaped growth curve levels off and reaches a carrying capacity. J-shaped growth curves have rapid exponential growth, typical of our selected species. They show mass extinction events as resources are exhausted, and mostly found in closed systems. And that's because if it were an open system, there would not be a mass extinction because the individuals or organisms would leave and find a new place to live if they were running out of resources. The S-shaped growth curve is logistic, so it doesn't increase as fast as the J-shaped growth curve. It is typical of K-selected species, and there is slow level off to competition for limited resources. It reaches a dynamic equilibrium. This is found mostly in open systems. So our selected species, we can remember it in two ways. First of all, they are smaller animals, and it's represented with a lowercase letter, or you can think R for rats. They are smaller. Versus K-selected species, it's always written with the capital letter, and also you can think K for kangaroo. It is a larger animal. When a limiting factor, like limited food, water, or temperature changes, is introduced to a population, the curve results in an S-shape, typical of K-selected species. As organisms respond to increased nutrients, the natality increases. Equilibrium is established again, and the curve levels off. A new carrying capacity is reached. So let's take a look at the S-shaped growth curve. Here we have the lag phase, so not much growth. Then we have the growth phase, and here's where it's different from the J-shaped growth curve. It reaches a stationary phase where it has dynamic equilibrium. So down here we have an old carrying capacity where it looked like it had leveled off, but then the scientists watched this organism as it began to increase in population size, reaching a new carrying capacity. Now, when we're drawing carrying capacity, we draw it in the middle of the portion that is up and down. We don't draw it at the top because once it's reached the top, it decreases, and we don't draw it at the bottom because it increases. The carrying capacity is the balance at the top. So it's not right at the top, it's not at the bottom of the up and down, it's right in that middle. And so the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals an environment can support. And again, It's not the top of the growth curve. It's somewhere in the middle of the up and down portion of the dynamic equilibrium part of the growth curve. Open population growth curves represent the dynamic equilibrium that is a result of the balance between biotic potential, which is stable. It's because it's the maximum natality under ideal conditions. That cannot change. For example, deer have 1 or 2 offspring maximum every year. They can't suddenly have 10 offspring just because they have more food that year. Their maximum natality is 2 every year under ideal conditions. Environmental resistance includes all the biotic and abiotic factors that limit growth. This can change. Biotic and abiotic factors are always fluctuating. Okay, to go back to the S-shaped growth curve, the environmental resistance is keeping the numbers down. So again, that's anything in the environment, abiotic or biotic, that limits the numbers in the population. And biotic potential, the number of offspring born over time, it keeps up the numbers. Biotic potential is the maximum number of offspring produced in ideal conditions, and it's regulated by 4 factors. Offspring, or the maximum number of individuals born per birth. Survival capacity, the chance that offspring will reach reproductive age. Procreation, number of times per year an organism reproduces. And maturity, age when reproduction begins. The procreation, or the number of times per year an organism reproduces, is affected by the length of pregnancy or gestation. For example, humans can only procreate every 9 months because that takes that long for gestation, for birth, whereas mice take about 19 days of gestation, and so they can reproduce quicker than can humans. Environmental resistance are all factors that limit population growth. Biotic or living include food, disease, predation, availability of mates, and abiotic or non-living include things like water, space, natural disasters, and sunlight. State whether the environmental resistance is biotic or abiotic. Decreasing oxygen supply. That's non-living, so that is abiotic. Low food supply. Food is biotic. Disease, like bacteria, is biotic. Predators are living organisms, so that's biotic. Limited space is abiotic. Okay, let's do a practice question. How does the population growth rate compare from 1800 to 1850 with that of 1960 to 1974? Well, if we look on the graph, this is a much lower growth than is the time here. So we could say it's slower in the 1800s, or it's a lag phase in the 1800s, or we could say it's the growth phase in the 1900s. Next, what may have caused the population crash? When we're looking at this, it's a good idea to read the title, Population Explosion and Crash, where it's happening, St. Matthew Island, Burling Sea. And what are we talking about? What kind of animal is this? It is a reindeer. Okay, and it's over years from 1942 to 1966. We see the number started out at 29, it increases to 6,000, and then suddenly decreased to 42 individuals. So what may have caused the population crash? Sudden depletion in resources, maybe, natural disaster, parasites, infections, or starvation. What is this effect called? So when almost the entire population dies and only a few remain, there's a couple of names that we can give it. It's the bottleneck effect, which is a type of genetic drift. So both answers are acceptable. Here, let's take a look at this graph. We have number of survivors out of 1,000. We have humans, birds, and marine fish. Which species numbers decrease rapidly at a young age? So here we have age along the bottom. This would be young. And we see the green line here, the fish. They decrease rapidly at a young age. Which species tend to live the longest? So we look up here. This is the longest living, and that would be humans. Give 2 reasons for this. Well, we can give a few reasons. First of all, humans have no predators. Humans care for their young. Humans have only 1 or 2 offspring to look after. And humans have health care. right? Birds and fish, they're not going to go to the doctor if they get sick. Okay, last graph to look at, we have Heather Williams and we have Christine Cortez. We can see one generation here is 18 to 20 years, and down here, one generation, 36 to 38 years. Who had children when they were 18 to 20 years old? That would be Heather Williams. So then the younger or older, circle one, a person is, when they start having children, the more offspring they will produce in a quicker time. And if we look at this graph, we can see way more offspring produced, and it was 18 to 20 years growth, so that's younger. Okay, limiting factors are the same thing as environmental resistance. They affect population size and include things like flood, fire, extreme cold, disease, starvation, and predation. The law of the minimum states that the substance with the lowest concentration will limit growth. This is known as the limiting factor. So let's say food 1 year. Food is limited, and so that would be the limiting factor. Limiting factors can be classified as density dependent. These are biotic limiting factors, things like disease, starvation, and predation. And the reason that they are density dependent is because if there's a disease in a population and the individuals live closely together and there's more of them, then they are more likely to spread the disease. For example, bacteria spreads faster in more dense populations. Or, to make it related to today's, in 2020, COVID spreads faster if you are in bigger groups, and that's why we isolate. Density-independent factors are abiotic limiting factors, like flood, fire, or extreme cold. This affects population regardless of the number of individuals. For example, if a flood came along and covered, let's say, all of Alberta, it doesn't matter how close or apart we are living, everyone would be affected by the flood. Name the density dependent factor. So again, let's take a look at the graph. We have the number of reindeer, and we have decline as a sudden result of sudden resource depletion. So the density dependent factor in this case is the lack of food, or grass, which is biotic. Populations can be classified as K-selected or R-selected. K-selected, remember we said K for kangaroo, it's larger species. They have a long lifespan, a late reproductive age, which means the age at which they first start to reproduce is later than R-selected. For example, deer start to reproduce when they are 2 years old. Mice can reproduce when they're about 6 weeks old. Low reproductive rate, they don't have many offspring. They require parental care. They are large individuals, near carrying capacity, so they reach that dynamic equilibrium. They have a long gestation period or time of pregnancy. Examples include deer, bears, moose, and elm tree. So it doesn't just have to be animals, it can also be plants. It's any living organism. R-selected have a short lifespan, so it's the opposite of K-selected. Early reproductive age, high reproductive rate, many offspring, require little or no parental care. They're smaller. They do not reach a carrying capacity. They have a short gestation or pregnancy. Examples include bacteria, insects, rodents, and dandelions. Now, when we're comparing R and K selected, it's relative, so it depends which ones you are comparing. Consider the following, which is R selected, a mouse or a wolf? Well, mouse are smaller and they have more offspring, so in this comparison, the mouse is the R selected species. How about between wolf and moose? In this case, the wolf have more offspring and they are smaller individuals than moose, so they are the R-selected species. Let's compare a mouse and a beetle. In this case, the beetle is the R-selected species because beetles can have hundreds of offspring at once, whereas mice can have at maximum maybe 10 offspring. So K strategists, they're larger, they have fewer offspring versus R strategists are smaller and they have more offspring.